Tell me why it costs $1,003 to fly from Nairobi to Lagos, but only $922 to fly from Nairobi all the way to London, or Dubai, or Istanbul. Nairobi to Lagos is about 3,800 kilometers. Nairobi to London is about 6,800 kilometers. Further, but cheaper. And before you say it is because Africa is far from everything, the distance from Nairobi to Lagos is roughly 3,000 kilometers. The distance from London to New York is 5,700. Europe crosses an ocean to reach America for less money than we cross our own continent to reach each other. This is why. Africa is home to roughly 20% of the world's population. It covers more land area than the United States, China, India, and most of Europe combined. It accounts for approximately 3% of global air passenger volumes. 3% for a continent that is home to 1 in 5 people on Earth. And of that 3%, the majority of those flights are not between American cities. They are between Africa and the rest of the world. Intra-African travel. Africans flying to other African countries accounts for roughly 30% of all travel on the continent. The other 70% flows outward. Africa is not flying within itself. It is flying out. Look at this map. The distance from Lagos in Nigeria to Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo, two of the biggest economies on the continent, is roughly 1,800 kilometers. The distance from London to Athens is 2,900 kilometers, noticeably further. London to Athens, a direct flight, under 4 hours, bookable today for under £100. Lagos to Kinshasa, there are no reliable direct flights. Routed through Johannesburg, Addis Ababa, or Nairobi, the journey can take 15 hours and in some cases more than 20. 20 hours, in some cases, for a journey that is shorter than London to Athens. This is not the aviation system of a continent that is building for its own people. This is what an aviation system looks like when it was never designed for internal connectivity in the first place. So, how did it get this way? The answer has 3 parts and none of them are the one most people assume. The easy assumption is that airlines are the problem. That African carriers are inefficient or greedy or simply bad at their jobs. The reality is more complicated and the first place to look is not the airline. It is the government. Across Africa, aviation is treated as a luxury to be taxed rather than a lifeline to be enabled. The result is what analysts call the sky tax. A layer of government fees and charges that in many cases costs more than the flight itself. On a $100 base fare for a short intra-African route, African governments frequently add between $60 and $80 in taxes and fees. 60 to 80% of the ticket price goes not to the airline, not to fuel, not to the airport, but to the government. In West Africa, on one particular 20-minute flight between 2 cities in Senegal, the government taxes alone cost more than the ticket. You are paying more to the government for the right to take a 20-minute flight than you are paying the airline to actually fly you there. This is not unique to one country. It is a pattern across the continent. Governments that see a captive audience. People who need to travel and have limited options treat that audience as a revenue source rather than an economic opportunity. And the cost does not stop at taxes. Jet fuel in Africa is 17% more expensive than the global average. The cost for an airline to operate across the continent is nearly double what it costs elsewhere in the world. Airport fees, handling charges, ground support, all of it inflated compared to international standards. The result is that before a single passenger boards a plane, the airline is already operating at a significant structural disadvantage compared to any carrier flying the same distance in Europe, Asia, or North America. But the tax problem, as damaging as it is still not the deepest explanation. Because even if you removed every single tax tomorrow, the fundamental structure of African aviation would still be broken. And to understand why, you need to see where these flight paths actually came from. Look at this map. Look at where the major African airline hubs are located. Addis, Ababa, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Cairo, Casablanca. Now look at where they connect. London, Paris, Dubai, New York, Amsterdam. Almost every significant African air route flows outward first to a hub city, and then either out of the continent entirely or back inward to another African city via that hub. There is barely any direct network connecting African cities to each other. This is not an accident, it is a legacy. When colonial powers built infrastructure in Africa, they built it to extract, to move resources from the interior to the coast, and from the coast to Europe. Roads, railways, shipping routes, and eventually air routes were all designed with the same logic. Get things out, not move things around. The aviation networks that existed when African countries gained independence in the 1950s and 1960s were built on that same extractive logic. Routes connected African capitals to their colonial metropoles. London, Paris, Lisbon, Brussels, not to each other. 50 and 60 years after independence, those colonial flight paths are still the backbone of African aviation. The continent never rebuilt its connectivity from the inside out. It inherited an outward-facing system and largely kept it. The practical consequence is that flying from Lusaka to Lagos, Zambia to Nigeria, two African countries is not, in practice, a medium-haul flight. It is two long-haul flights assembled end-to-end, with a layover in between, because there is no direct connection, and you pay accordingly. Meanwhile, Gulf carriers, that is, Emirates, Qatar Airways, and Etihad, identified this vacuum and filled it deliberately. They built efficient hub networks pointed directly at Africa. When your cheapest option to get from one African city to another routes through Dubai, it is not because the geography makes sense. It is because Dubai built the infrastructure that African countries never built for themselves. The Gulf carriers did not create this problem. They found it and turned it into a business. The question is whether African countries can build the alternative. And here is where the story gets genuinely infuriating, because the answer already exists on paper. In 1999, African heads of state gathered and signed the Yamoussoukro Decision, a continental open skies agreement that should have deregulated African airspace, allowed airlines to fly freely across borders, created competition, and driven prices down. It was exactly the policy African aviation needed. Then, in 2018, 19 years later, they gathered again and signed the Single African Air Transport Market, a new framework to finally implement what Yamoussoukro had promised nearly 2 decades earlier. 2 agreements, decades apart, the same problem, still not solved. Here is why. Every single African country individually has a rational sense to protect its national airline. The routes that carrier flies are sometimes the only reliable air link to smaller cities in the country. The airline employs people. It is a symbol of national identity. A flag carrier in the most literal sense, a plane with your country's colours flying into international airports. Opening the skies means foreign carriers can compete on those routes. And the honest reality is that most African national airlines, many of them state-owned and loss-making, would struggle to survive that competition. So every country signs the agreement, and then every country finds a reason not to implement it. A regulatory technicality here, a delayed cabinet approval there, a national carrier that needs protecting just a little longer. The collective outcome, cheaper, better connected, more competitive African aviation remains permanently just out of reach. Not because any single government is uniquely corrupt or uniquely short-sighted, but because the incentive structure makes cooperation individually costly and doing nothing individually safer. This is not simply corruption. It is a collective action problem, and collective action problems are significantly harder to solve because there is no single villain to remove and no single policy to bypass. Every actor is behaving rationally. The system as a whole is behaving absurdly. The result is that Africa's richest man needs 35 visas. That it costs more to fly from Nairobi to Lagos from Nairobi to London. That a 20-minute flight in Senegal costs more in government taxes than an airfare. But the story does not end there, because something is changing. Rwanda is a landlocked country of 14 million people with no obvious geographic advantage as an aviation hub. Over the past decade, Rwanda Air has made a deliberate strategic decision to build an intra-African network. Not just routes to London or Dubai, but actual direct connections between African cities routed through Kigali. They entered the space that everyone else abandoned and found passengers waiting there. Ethiopian Airlines has done something similar on a larger scale. Its Addis Ababa hub is genuinely world-class. Its expansion across African routes have been aggressive, and its long-haul network completes with the best carriers in the world, which means it has to stay sharp. It is proof that an African carrier, run as a commercial operation rather than a political project, can genuinely be competitive. These are not charity cases, they are businesses that identified a market, Africans who want to travel within Africa and build infrastructure to serve it. The question is whether they can be replicated, whether the political consensus needed to actually implement SAATM will eventually materialize, whether the economic case for open skies will become compelling enough that national governments choose collective growth over individual protection. If it does, if SATM is fully implemented, if the sky taxes are reduced, if the direct routes are built, analysts estimate that intra-African air traffic could more than double. Ticket prices could drop by up to 40%. Over $1 billion could flow back into African economies through increased travel and trade. The blueprint is there, the agreements are signed, the models exist. What is missing is a political will to choose the continent over the carrier. Let's have a debate in the comment section. What do you think about this entire issue, and how best can Africans freely travel within Africa and at a much affordable price? Subscribe for more deep dives like these, and hope to see you on the next one. Keep exploring.